Hey, Honors Bio folks. The topic of this quick little video lecture is ecological succession. It's an ecological process that happens when land basically changes over time. If you look at the definition here, like I was saying, succession, there's actually two types. There's one type that is called primary succession and second that's called secondary succession. They act and work basically the same way. But what happens is land during primary succession, it starts from bare rock. So this would be a case of, let's say, a glacier, like here in Minnesota, coming through 10,000 years ago. It acts like a bulldozer. It scrapes away the top layer of everything on top, including all the soil or most of the soil. So you're left with just bare bedrock right there. It could also be the case if there was, say, volcanic activity happening, like when the Hawaiian Islands were forming, for example. That bare rock needs to go from what it is, bare rock, to what you currently would see in Hawaii, which is these tropical lush forests. How does that happen? That process is succession. Secondary, on the other hand, the case with secondary succession is when something brings it down to but leaves the actual soil. So it could be something like a very massive forest fire which burns away most of the trees and shrubs and grasses but leaves the soil and the soot and the ash. Or it could be floods, human impact, where we basically scrape everything away. Those are all examples of secondary succession. The resulting thing is something we've already mentioned, is a climax community. And if you remember, a climax community, what I talked about with you guys was that when you see a climax community, that is sort of the final stage, and that is when you see what that mind's eye view of a biome. So if I said a desert, it's that thing you see in your mind with the desert conditions, the dry, the cactuses, maybe the sand. That's the climax community. So I got a couple images here. Here's an image from a text that shows primary succession. So if you look at the bottom here, the axis on the bottom there says time in hundreds of years. This would be what we call primary succession, because as you can see in the beginning, right here, it starts with bare rock, be it from a glacier or from volcanic activity. In this case, it's probably more of a glacier thing. The first organisms that kind of take over, they call it the pioneer stages, just like the pioneers are the first Europeans to come through and settle the West here in the United States. The pioneer stage here would be organisms like lichens. Now, if you remember anything about lichens, if you've heard about lichens, they grow on rocks, and they essentially digest or break down that rock and create the thinnest margin of soil. And over time, as the lichens continue to work, the soil builds up a little bit and a little bit and a little bit. And as it gets thicker, you kind of slide over, and then you can get some mosses, which actually have to sort of root down into that soil. And then as the mosses, as they go through their lifespan and they die and they decay, like the cycles of matter that we were talking about, all of that stuff that decays then makes more and more soil, and that soil is very rich because of all the organic material. Then the soil gets deep enough that you can support some smaller things, some weeds, some small short herbs. Then grasses take root. Once you've got grasses, you're pretty much well on your way. You're into the intermediate stages of primary succession, where the soil is thick enough and the grass with all the roots will hold it in place so it doesn't get washed away or blown away with the wind or eroded away. Then you can really start to get some serious buildup, shrubs, then into some of the coniferous trees, which tend to grow in thinner soil. And then eventually, if it was an area like here in Egan, then you'd see those hickories and maples and the trees that we have around here. And that would be the climax community. So in this example, the climax community right here would be the climax community for an area like us, so we'd call it a deciduous forest. Key here to remember, things to remember, lichens are right here. Those are the pioneering organism that goes in and takes over. And then it works its way over time, hundreds of years, thousands of years sometimes, to make that climax community. Now, the next step then would say, all right, we get this climax community, but what happens when this climax community has a forest fire, has a flood, has some human impact, has something that causes the trees and most of the plants to get washed away, burned away, whatever. Then we get what's called secondary succession. Kind of a simple photo here, but it shows very clearly what happens with secondary succession. You start with that nice forest. In this case, a forest fire happens, burns away all the organic matter, leaves soil. Then much quicker this time, the soil will then be there, so you don't have to have lichens to grow it, create more thicker soil. Now the plants can come in a lot faster, so then here you get your pioneering stages with your grasses, very quickly followed by shrubs, small trees, and eventually then obviously you will get to that climax community right here at the end. All right, so primary versus secondary. Primary takes a long time because it has to start from bare rock. Secondary much faster because it already has the soil in place. Again, just highlighting a couple terms with succession. We have our pioneer community. This is over time, so you basically can think of this as over time here. And then you end up with the climax community, relates to the biomes we talked about. The main organism, I guess, if you want to say, that takes place here would be a lichen, is the thing that gets the process going. And if you don't know much about lichens, lichens are an organism. It's a symbiotic relationship between a fungi and an algae. And it's a symbiotic relationship so they can survive on those bare rocks. One provides food, the other provides some protection and hold on the rock. And that's what they're going to do to create this succession process. Almost done here. Just wanted to make sure we had a definition of a climax community. Remember, each biome has a climax community. It's that thing that I said you'd see in your mind's eye when I say think of a rainforest. It's that stable collection of plants and animals that are adapted to that specific area. It will stay as that, as a climax community, until something disrupts it, be it a fire, human impact, even global warming could change things, because if the temperatures change or the rainfall precipitation amounts change, then the community will have to modify and adapt to that, and the climax community could change. So what used to be a nice deciduous forest, if the climate gets colder, it may morph and change into a coniferous forest, for example. It doesn't just happen on land. This is something that here in Minnesota you've probably seen, or at least seen in the stages of. Succession can happen with ponds as well. Our numbers are a little out of whack here, but basically the concept with pond succession is the same kind of idea. It's changing over time, but it's the pond action here. So you can see in the number one, just ignore that number 3 there. But the number 1, you have a normal pond. It's got a little bit of swamp around the edge, but it's there. It's a pond. Now over time, you can see in number 2, the sediment has built up at the bottom of that pond. It's becoming much more swampy, if you will. It's nice and moist around there, so some different trees are starting to grow. 3 would be up over here. In picture 3 now, it's so much sediment that it's very swampy now. Most of the water is gone or in the process of going. And then in number 4, the sediment has built up so much that now what used to be a normal pond is now a kind of a marshy area, and then it actually could become a field and eventually a forest. If you have ponds that don't have a lot of lakes or rivers going in or out, any inputs or outputs, this can tend to happen because sediment will build up from stuff rushing in. Like a lot of the small ponds in Egan, this will happen to if you go forwards hundreds or thousands of years. Just another example of succession. And then lastly, just to remind you guys, in Minnesota, there are essentially 4 climax communities, which means 4 biomes. Pardon my terrible drawing here. But if that is the state of Minnesota, remember we said prairies exist sort of down into this area. That would be our prairies. Our deciduous forests would be much like what we have down here in Egan. They kind of cover this area. Our coniferous forests would be sort of our north woods-ish area, kind of in here in the boundary waters. And then the tall grass aspen parkland is that sort of new designation that we find up in the corner up there in northwest Minnesota. Anyway, that takes you through the idea of succession. If you guys need to To view this again, I'll leave it up on the website for the rest of the trimester. If you want to go back and take some notes from it, that would be awesome. You're going to do an activity in class tomorrow using this information that you've seen. You can review this in class on a device if you need to help you out with what you're doing. But that's a quick little video lecture for you. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.